Speaker, it being 6:20 p.m., it's a great time to talk about wine, Canadian wine. And Mr. Speaker, what a lot of people in the gallery or listening tonight might not realize is that if you buy a bottle of wine that's labeled international blends with Canadian wine or cellared in Canada, the content of that wine might not be entirely Canadian. And a lot of our Canadian wine producers take issue with this labeling standard. This labeling standard was designated as an interim measure in 1994. This was a period of time in which Canada's wine industry was actually really sort of coming to the forefront. The North American Free Trade Agreement had just been signed. There were a lot of provisions put in place in order to see some of our producers rip up old Labrusca varietal wines and plant it with vinifera wine. And some of the producers at that time said, look, we're going to have an inventory gap for a while. We want to stay competitive. Can we have an interim designation on country of origin labeling that allows us to bring in wine from other areas? We can label it as such until some of our vines get up and going. Now, Mr. Speaker, it's over 22 years later, I believe, this interim measure is still in place. And this is a great source of consternation for a variety of wine producers. The wine industry in Canada now is over $6 billion. It has a huge economic impact. Canadian producers are not just producing quantity of wine, but they're also producing internationally award-winning wines. And what I've heard in my when I was in government as Minister of State for Western Economic Diversification, and still today, is that people don't think that this interim designation is fair. They think that it should change. And there's a lot of industry division on this. When I was a minister, I funded a project that was to look at competitivity and ways to make the industry in BC more competitive. One of the recommendations coming out of this project, I believe, was looking at this particular designation. What some of the smaller producers in Canada say is that the larger wine industry lobby groups are not advocating for a change on this. The larger producers and you know what, they produce a lot of revenue off of this, and there certainly is a demand for lower priced wine that comes from the international blends. There's no question of that. But the smaller producers are saying, hey, maybe we shouldn't have this designation anymore. The larger producers are saying, well, maybe this should just be promulgated and make this designation permanent. What I'd like to see, as someone who doesn't think this is a particular partisan issue, is a parliamentary committee study this. I don't think that this issue has been adequately addressed at the public service or bureaucratic level. I know that the minister has been very open to having a parliamentary study of this particular concept. My question to my colleague is very simple. What is the government's intent on this? I know some in the industry would like this issue just to go away. They wouldn't like to have a parliamentary committee review this. I really think this is important because of the industry is asking for other things like an tax exemption for capital equipment investments for wineries. I don't even think we can look at that issue until we address the cellared in Canada issue, Mr. Speaker. So my question is very simple. Will the government commit to a parliamentary study of this designation, and can they tell us the status if they are considering actually promulgating this interim measure into law? Because I certainly think that there's a lot of producers in Canada that would not support that.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Agriculture. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleague for her question, but I will give her more detail. The label on a food is one of the most important and direct way for consumers to obtain information on a product. Food labeling helps consumers make the distinction between the foods they eat and the brands available in order to make intelligent choices. A label on any product in Canada must be neither false nor misleading. Requirements for country of origin apply to many products in Canada, including imported wines, canned foods, meat, and other products. Country of origin must be indicated, particularly on cases of standardized wine sold in Canada. This is for wines made in the country or imported. Country of origin information has to appear in both English and French. Country of origin must appear on the main portion of the label. For wine, this is an area on the bottle that can be seen without having to turn the bottle around. Wines that are a mixture and contain wines from different countries of origin, blended wines, the label recognizes Canada's contribution and indicates that the wine contains imported ingredients. For example, the label might say that the wine has been made in Canada from imported grapes and Canadian grapes. For wines blended in Canada from ingredients from a single country, the statement country of origin can be presented in a number of ways. For example, we say blended in Canada from foreign grapes. That can be used if all grapes come, say, from Italy. Other statements can appear on the label, for example, formulated to show how much of the wine and what portion of the wine is made in Canada or produced in Canada. Companies can say produced in Canada with the accompanying descriptive statement when the last significant processing stage of the product in question was in Canada, even if the ingredients come from other countries. Product of Canada must be accompanied by a descriptive statement showing that the food in question is made in Canada from ingredients that were imported or ingredients that were grown in Canada. As I said earlier, Mr. Speaker, the country of origin must appear on the label of some products, particularly wine. Products that don't need such labeling, there are many of them, and the companies that manufacture them can choose whether to show country of origin on the label or not. They can choose to show Canadian added value. And of course, any information on a label must be false and not misleading. It must be false, must be true and not misleading.
What's happening in Canada right now is essentially, if you went to buy a bottle of Canadian wine and it said cellared in Canada, it's sort of like buying a can of Coke or wanting to buy a can of Coke that's actually filled with no-name cola, but it's got the Coke label on it. That's what happens when we label Canadian wines as Canadian, but they're not Canadian. And in British Columbia, there's actually no requirement to have any Canadian content in the wine whatsoever to have it called cellared in Canada. That's crazy. This summer, Mr. Speaker, wineries from across the country are going to be placing petitions in their tasting rooms where thousands of Canadians and tourists will sign petitions asking to have this particular designation removed. This is happening already. I would ask my colleague opposite to go beyond his talking points that were provided by his bureaucrats and admit the fact that this labeling designation, it's not a standard country of origin labeling designation. It's an interim measure that was put in place over 22 years ago when the wine industry was very young, very nascent. We're now making award-winning wines. We're putting the Canadian brand on wines that don't come from Canadian content. And many Canadian producers who invest so much time and effort into that production aren't getting their fair due. So, Mr. Speaker, again, will my colleague consider a parliamentary study, and many winery producers are listening to this tonight. There's a lot that are tuned in. Will they consider a parliamentary study of this 22-year, out-of-date, interim, quote-unquote, measure?
Secrétaire parlementaire.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Mr. Speaker, the government is looking at the regulations on food labelling, including country of origin designation on labels. As part of the initiative to modernize food labelling, the initiative is intended to establish a food labelling system that is more modern, innovative, and makes it possible to find a balance between consumer expectations and industry needs. The initiative will focus on changes that will enable the industry to commercialize their products effectively on the market while properly informing consumers. As we move forward with modernizing labeling, we will continue mobilizing stakeholders. Canadians want to be informed on the products they buy for themselves and for their families. We are committed to modernizing food labeling in order to provide Canadians with the information they need. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.